Orc structures in the 40k universe are ramshackle buildings scavenged from whatever the orcs can get their hands on. They're barely held together with welds and bolts and really prettied up with paint literally thrown at it. And that style of painting perfectly matches my own. It's quick and dirty, experimental, messy, and, well, it's fun. I'm Sam, and in this tutorial on how I paint orc terrain from Kill Team Octarius, I'm going to show you my method of throwing paint on and not worrying about how to be perfect. It's the really orky mentality, throw things together and see what happens. So settle in, or follow along if you want, as we throw paint on plastic. It all starts with a black primer, or not really. It doesn't matter what color you use as long as it's dark. Even blue or a deep red would work. I've gone with black because I want some recesses and shadow, and it's not a perfect prime either. I use a brush on primer since I don't have a place to use spray cans or an airbrush, but the side effect of that is sometimes you get brush strokes and grey plastic showing through, and that's fine. It adds a little bit of character and texture to the piece. I use a few different metallics since this whole structure is metal, and this is to get an interesting color profile that we can base the rest of our paint job on. All of these metallics are applied with different size makeup brushes, and this gives you some really smoky transitions. To start, it's a heavy dry brush with LEADBELCHER. The recesses and cracks will still show some black, but if it gets silver in there, it's no problem. The washes are going to do their thing later and sort that out. RUNELORD brass gets thrown into the mix for a little color variation. This will also help in simulating the layers of rust on some of the metals, so it's only used in a few selected locations. I don't spend a lot of time thinking, since this is all about just getting a base down that you're really not going to see, so I stab and prod, dry brush, and push the paint around where it needs to go. To take this even further, I put some fulgurite copper onto some very few select surfaces. I'm using a smaller makeup brush now, so it's even a bit more targeted. This copper color really pops out from the lighter metals, and I'm placing it in a way that separates different parts of the models, a panel here and there and different mechanical parts. A lot of this will get covered up later with other paints, but it's still a nice starting point. The washes pull all the metallics back into a coherent saturation. AGRAX EARTHSHADE is first, and I start fairly light, but I quickly go heavier. It's not that I'm worried about how heavy I go, since I can always undo the mistakes with wicking it away with a brush or a bit of tissue. But what's nice at this stage is that the bright fulgurite copper part starts to stand out, even though it's had a wash put over it. While the first wash is wet, I throw down some NULN oil. Sure, you could wait for the wash to dry, but I can pretend and say that I'm looking to get nice transitions between the two washes and create some variation. The truth is, I'm impatient and I don't mind it being messy. I do wash the inside walls and under the floors, but I don't spend too much time on that after this. It's not something you will really see that often, so why bother spending time on it? Remember, this is quick and dirty. It's all about getting it done. To bring a little bit of shine back out, I go in with some RUNEFANG steel and dry brush up the edges. It's really not that noticeable, but it does give a new definition to the edges of girders and panels. And then it's back in with some fulgurite copper to bring out the parts I hit before. I was actually surprised on the color modulation you can achieve with using all these different metallics and washes. And I gotta say, fulgurite copper might be my new favorite metallic. And once I've done that, it's back again to some RUNEFANG steel, just to make those edges pop a little bit more. I'll be honest, you could leave the piece here and it would be more than functional on the tabletop. There is a lot of variation in the metallics and washes, so it's not only quick to paint, but it actually gives you a lot to look at. But I want to add a bit of color to this. I did spend a lot of time thinking about what to use, and I finally settled on blue. The two glyph panels as well as the tanks were painted up in a rough, haphazard way. You hit it fast and rough, be loose with the edges, and leave some bare metal in here and there. It's a cheap trick to simulate some paint chipping. I then made up a very watery mix of MACRAGGE blue and GENESTEALER purple to create a mauve or lavender color for the metal holding the structure together. And like I said, it is a really watered down mix, and that's by design. I want this to be movable around the piece, pushing it and soaking it up with a brush, but it's also something that can be easily dabbed away with a finger or tissue, as well as drying in a really patchy way. While those blues were drying, it was time to get to that door. My plan here was to just experiment and play around. In my mind, I had that this door was actually an inside bulkhead door painted with materials that wouldn't last very long outside. And I should stress that that's an important point. What's the story behind this piece? That's really going to send you in a certain paint direction. And in this case, I wanted something that was old and not looked after. So I started with ABADDON black, painting with a very watered down mix so I could let gravity take it where it wanted to go and simulate this paint turning to a sludge in whatever toxic atmosphere this poor door was stuck in. So I pushed it around, wiped it away with tissues, added more water, more paint, and repeated this for some time. The aim of the black and the other colors was to create an interesting layered texture of different paints and colors. I do come back to the door quite frequently, but I wanted to add some contrast paint to add a little bit of slight color variations. Blood Angel's red was slathered on, wiped off, then watered down. It's an extremely subtle and hard to see on camera, but you get this slight red film over the metal that separates it from the rest. The red also gets stuck around the rivets in the recesses as well. It's these little tiny additions that do have an impact, even if it is that subtle and barely visible. I also do this on a few other panels with different colors, adding it on, taking it off, watering it down, and so on. Again, you get all these tide marks and stains of paint that all adds to the overall effect I'm trying to achieve. The Ork glyphs needed some more love, so it's back to them with some white to make them stand out. It needs multiple layers to get smooth coverage, and I'm really trying hard not to spill onto the blue. It's really the only time I'm being careful, since I want these faces to stand out, since they are really the focal point of the piece, so it really does pay to take some care here. To separate the faces from the blue, I use some DRAKENHOF Nightshade to line the panels. I also pull this wash down to the bottom of the blue panel to get some modulations of that color, so it's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. I do go back and forth on this for a while, trying to get a distinct coloring difference, but it's really not that successful. I'm starting to think with a lighter blue might have worked better at the top, and then adding the wash over that. With that modulation in mind, I started on the lower portions of the white Ork glyphs with NAZDREG yellow. By using a little bit and dragging it to the bottom of the panels, it creates this dirty, rusty look with all kinds of grime falling, rolling downwards and getting caught at the bottom. It creates this really nice stain, and it's the thing that actually makes me the most happy out of anything else in this paint up. To simulate chipping and weathering on the dark blue and lighter purpley blues, I came in with some TECLIS blue and hit the edges. It's a simple technique and can be easily enhanced with some more smaller flicks of metallics, but it just gives you a little variation in the blue. I hit up every blue piece on the terrain to act as some very rough highlights. To make the orky teeth stand out, I stabbed on some white scar. I took the same approach, wiped off a little bit, painted again, wiped it off, left bits around the edges. Again, it's a really simple technique, but it is super fast and you can do it really easily. The light bulbs were also painted white, so I had a nice bright color to work off later on. And then I also went back to the door and smacked on some white and again, pulled it back with water and cloth. The rest of the piece were looking a little samey, so a few other panels were hit with white in the same way I wanted, and then later we're going to go back and add some other colors. The door was a little too white now, so I came back in with some yellow and gave it this really gross yellowy hue. It was a bit too strong, so with some wet mixing on the model, with some white scar and the usual more water, wipe it all off, repeat, it started to look a lot nicer. While it was all still wet, I dropped some AGRAX EARTHSHADE, and this saturated the whole area to a nice dirty yellowish browny white, exactly what I was after. And it also had this strange reaction of pulling up paint that I'd already put on the model. So wiping it all away with a tissue, I was left with a whole lot of different color mixes, which is really the look I was going for. So heating up those fresh white panels, I grabbed some GENESTEALER purple straight out of the pot. Again, I would hit it, pull it back by wiping it off with some water and some cloth, sometimes even taking the paint off completely, but leaving some bare visible stains. It's at this stage that I figure out the best way to approach the rest of the process, and that is using very watered down paint, sometimes even just straight out of the pot, let the paint and gravity do what it wants to do, push it around, wipe it off, and repeat. So with that worked out, I went back with some TECLIS blue, painted a few more panels, and I can't stress how working this way and being rough and quick with the paints and brushes adds to the texture and overall feel. I don't feel that you can get those incidental and accidental pullings of paints or tide marks if you try to do it. This is where the real test is about to start. So rust. This was a major gamble. I was working with bright colors and I knew I didn't want to dull those colors down. So the rust had to not only complement those colors, but also not overpower it. And I started somewhat carefully, for me anyway, with a heavily watered down Wild Rider red. It's almost a fluorescent orange that ticked the boxes I was looking for. Well, I needed orange and I needed it to be bright. So on this first panel, I was more experimenting with the color and what I could do with it, but I quickly realized that I didn't need to add in the white scar. It did give it an interesting color modulation on the panel, but I knew I needed to be brave. So put it on, I told myself, just put it on everywhere. Don't worry how watery it is or if it covers everything. Just let the paint do its thing and then soak up what I could. And there is a line that you can cross here. I would have been happy to cover the whole thing in orange and rust everything up, but it wouldn't have been interesting to look at. Instead of subtle nuances of oranges mixing and tinting over other colors, everything would have had the same level of orange in all the crevices, around all the rivets and everything else. It would end up being really boring to look at and just plain unremarkable. So I was careful. I did spend a long time simply because I was enjoying this, but carefully was the mantra running through my head. I started at the bottom, thinking that most of the rust of this would start here and eased off as I went high. Some horizontal parts got more than others, some verticals got hit a little bit harder, and it's really just a matter of knowing when to stop. Less is always more when it comes to this type of thing. After the rust was mostly dried, it was a matter of doing some small things, such as adding some more metal scratches to the white panels, painting the light globes in a fluorescent green, and then some of the more obvious cables. And I just couldn't stay away from the door. One last coat of AGRAX EARTHSHADE gave me that last little bit I was looking for. And that's it. This paint job was all about experimenting and letting myself simply put paint on a model. I didn't really care if it ended up messy or looking a bit weird, and yeah, it's a little weird. The rust is crazy strong, but I actually really like it. I want to know what you think about it. Have I pushed it too far? Maybe I did, maybe not. And hey, if you enjoyed it, hit that like button. Much appreciated, and maybe watch another video. If not, I'll see you next time.